to welcome all the panelists.
Good morning. I'm extremely happy and privileged, as well as it's a pleasure to invite all of you here. I think necessity has made us break a lot of barriers and a lot of frontiers. Although we are all housebound, but we have found new ways to connect with each other to deal with this kind of a pandemic that at least I think our generation and the generation previous to ours has no experience on. And we are all learning on how to deal with the various aspects of this. And I think the constant refrain is in the present context about the Jaan and the Jahan. You know, whether lives and livelihoods both have to be saved, and what at the cost of the other. And, you know, it's a very fine balance. It's a delicate balance that we are trying to achieve, whereas both should not be compromised. And this webinar is an attempt to see how we can later take initiatives to ensure that the damage is minimized. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. The only thing that I want to do is to speak to all of you and to welcome our speakers, Professor Shahab Khan, Dr. Anjan Chakrabarti, Professor Imam Lahiri, Ms. Pooja Sharma, Mr. Emmanuel Thomas, and Ms. Vishakha, who has organized this, and our economics department of the college that has organized this with other colleagues of the department and all over the world. It's a wonderful endeavor, and I wish us all the best, and not just for this webinar, but also for the way that it will show us forward. Thank you very much. I shall mute myself and remove myself from the scene so that the panelists can take over now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Now, I would first like to introduce my first panelist, who is Professor Shahab Imam Khan. Professor Shahab Imam Khan is currently serving at the Department of International Relations, Jahangirnagar University, Bangladesh, and he's also the research director at Bangladesh Enterprise Institute. He is an eminent scholar in the field of security, foreign affairs, and national integrity institution. Professor Khan has served an advisor, consultant, board member of various international organizations like UNDP, UNODC, UN Women, International Union for Conservation Nature, USAID, International Fund for Agricultural Development, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, UK and Regional Centers for the Strategic Studies, Sri Lanka, and Jikau Foundation, Bangladesh. He also serves as a member of the various high-level committees formed by the government of Bangladesh. He led PBE pioneering research for UNDP Maldives, UN Women, and British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Professor Khan is regularly cited and interviewed by the international and national media. He is Senior Fellow to Hyman Institute of World Watch, Hyman, China, and Non-Resident Fellow of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. He has completed his fellowship at University of Delaware and Brigham in US and UK. He studied at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, University of Manchester, and University of Dhaka. Welcome, Professor Shahab, to this webinar.
Thank you. Am I clear? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are clearly audible.
Thank you very much. Should I start?
Yes, sure.
I mean, thank you very much. It's certainly a very delightful morning, and seeing old friends and new friends on the other side of the computer, which is certainly a very thrilling experience without any doubt. And at least COVID has made one thing possible, that we can communicate and share our knowledge despite the barriers that we had earlier. Now, one of the issues that we were actually discussing in UN platform as well as the WHO platform is that what the world would look like once the COVID is over. Whether people are able to is over. Now, obviously, with a little bit of understanding of political economy, of course, I certainly look into how the state perhaps perceives to be of COVID is going up and up.
Some problem with the audio?
Yeah, it is. It is. We can't hear.
Shall we?
Shall we? What should we
Is
do?
it possible to send a message to Zoom and say that we are facing this issue?
No, ma'am. Actually, it's a problem of connectivity. So Shahab must be facing some connectivity issue. We can do one thing. We can move to the next panelist, which is Emmanuel, and
Yeah.
then we can tell Shahab to
Join
some-
later.
I'm sorry.
No.
It just went off. Can you see me right now?
So
Yeah.
right now,
Now,
yes.
yeah, now
yes.
you're
Thank
audible.
you.
Yes.
Yeah, this is again a COVID pressure. Suddenly, our network is just going up and down. I mean,
Yeah.
again, that also gives us an idea that COVID is not doing justice to technologies too. So going back to the whole idea of what we have been perceiving about economic plan, or perhaps the debate between whether we need to spend more money on security or should we be prioritizing development as per the state or the political system desires. That is again also being challenged. And even yesterday we were discussing that the herd immunity approach to this particular COVID, even in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, and the idea of human lives, as the rector has rightly mentioned, the choice between the lives and the livelihoods, are again, once again, putting everybody into some sort of uneasy situation, which is certainly going to change our perception about state, economics, and politics. And definitely the idea of security will be heavily being contested over the period to come. Now, even if you look at South Asian total cases, I mean, that is again a part of the politics of number. And definitely when I talk about politics of number, it also links with how the government actually projects itself. Even if we are very happy with the GDP growth, somewhere between 3 to 6 or 8 or 9, whichever figure we bring in, or perhaps when we talk about the health services, even how many people are being tested for COVID, and whether we have spent enough resources in the past or in the present, or perhaps whether we have the capacity to reach out to 1.6 billion people living in the South Asian states. And perhaps that also challenges the whole notion of the Westphalian state system or the electoral system, by saying that whether we are actually delivering services which are quality, full of quality, or perhaps which are actually enhancing the productivity of the public. Even if you look at the stunting, even if you look at the malnutrition, calories consumption, we're far behind than the ASEAN state or perhaps any other so-called developed state. But one very interesting part that we also talk about when it is COVID, that this is one of the greatest equalizer since the World War I. Why? Because this is the first time all these states, whether it is United States or Russia, or perhaps even as vulnerable as the African states, have come into one consensus that this is a pandemic that cannot be dealt by ad hoc basis, or perhaps by plugging ourselves out from the multilateral agencies or institutions, whether it is World Bank or whether it is WHO or perhaps United Nations. And even Prime Minister Modi has initiated a great move by reactivating SARC, which was dormant for last 6 years. And the SARC Development Fund is now disbursing money for rapid response and pandemic management. So these are the things are coming back. And as we always say, that look at the economic policy making right now, or public policy making right now. The things that used to take ages for the state to decide is now being done in a matter of hours. And perhaps we haven't seen a phenomenal efficiency in public policy delivery and public policy making in our recent history. And that's one of the important factors for making a choice between macroeconomic stability or human security dimension that we have largely been debating in these countries. Now, even if you look at the whole thing of how technology is playing, and again, one of the critical factors that has come back to South Asian states, that how we use these technologies. Even if you look at the very basics of the COVID response, even if you use your soap and wash your hands, that saves a lot of people. But on the other hand, now we are also questioning whether technology can make a way out. If you look at the South Korean example, for an example, in the recent time, well, the technology played a very important role, but also they have gone for the manual system. Now, there is an increasing paranoia going on in the Western states or the liberal states or the liberal mercantile states by saying that whether this COVID is going to reinforce the state's capacity to monitor the privacy or public lives. And one of the critical factors that came up in this debate is that, look, now the states which are very quasi-authoritarian or quasi-dictatorship, or whether there is a quality of democracy is eroding. And the question now comes that with the tracking devices which are now being implemented, whether these countries will become much more of a surveillance state rather than economic welfare state, or whether this will essentially bolster the concentration of power within the hands of a few. So even if you look at this KGB or CIA or Mossad back in time, like it took for KGB to monitor 240 million people within a matter of 24 hours was never been possible until the last few years. Even Netanyahu has been heavily criticized for introducing tracking system, which was being criticized by the parliament. Now, given all these things, where does South Asia actually lies at the end of the day? Whether we will be going with the same economic planning, same choices, rational choices, so-called rational choices between the market and the human lives. And that's where the prisoner's dilemma lies. And who is going to take lead on that remains as a largely problematic. Even if you look at the privatization of the health sector has now come under fire once again, because the expenditure of the marginal poor, or perhaps the people living under the poor, has gone up. Even if you look at the overall expenditure in terms of public expenditure in health, I mean, we are still very much behind any of the region. 5.25% of government expenditure on an average is being spent in South Asia, whereas you are now seeing in Southeast Asia, I mean, our immediate neighbor, it is 10.42%. Or perhaps even if you go to OECD countries, this is again 17.76, whereas the world ratio still lies within 15.61. So that also tells you that the priority in the public health and priority in giving the private sector much more leverage has become another problematic at the moment of time. I mean, even if you look at the World Bank statistics or perhaps data, and 60 million South Asians essentially fall into the poverty trap because of high out-of-pocket health expenditures. So henceforth, the whole idea of health expenditure, health security has to be mainstreamed once again in the economic policy planning. Even if you look at the Bangladeshi informal sector, I mean, one thing very much common among these three states, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or India, is the informal economy. And informal economy does not necessarily fall within the safety net or within the economic welfare structure of the state. And henceforth, the question remains that what happens to these almost like 80-90% population. Even if you see it in Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, everywhere it is between 70% to 90%. Even if you look at the Bangladesh's informal sector, and which is like absolutely in a shamble at the moment, with having almost 1 million people getting annexed in the employment sector. You are now seeing 8.9% of our annual income for them essentially is being spent on the health. And that creates a huge economic loss. And I'm sure my economist friends over here who has better understanding of economics than me, obviously 37.4% in Bangladesh and 38.1% in Nepal and other places is essentially quite a burden. And I'm sorry, apologies. And this COVID is not going to go away anytime soon. Now, even if you look at the recent virus discoveries or the bacteria discoveries with the glacier melt, with the melting of ice, with the melting of Siberian tundra or Antarctica or Arctic ice, is essentially now giving rise to the old dormant bacteria and viruses, which means even 75 years old anthrax, which was recovered from the Siberian tundra and from a reindeer which was buried under the ice, has created another havoc in Siberia. And now the NASA has been able to recover virus and bacteria from Mexican mines. They have been able to recover or discover viruses from other sources. So which means we are now, with the changes of the environment, we are now seeing that new diseases are coming back. So the question still, we are in a very nuanced state to understand whether this virus is going to come back or this virus is going to continue. If it continues, then obviously we have something to think about whether the economic policy making can continue like this. Even if you look at Mumbai right now, even if you look at Mumbai right now, even in Dharavi slums where 2.5 square kilometer, almost 1 million people lies, and even if you look at Bangladesh having 1 million people in the Rohingya refugee places, where essentially lockdown is a fancy item. The obvious reason is the urban planning, urban processing, or perhaps the governance regime does not provide enough impetus for the low income or the informal sector or the people living in Dharavi slums or Rohingya refugee camps to really practice what the Westerner has essentially introduced. So the question remains, how are we going to ensure with the ensure security and ensure service delivery in the urban centers like Delhi, Dhaka, or Kathmandu, or even if you take Calcutta. And obviously one of the critical important factor that has come up is the Western Asian racism. Even if you look, President Trump has recently introduced anti-immigration executive order because according to him, he wants to protect the employment. So therefore, the motive behind his anti-immigration policy is essentially economic. But on the other hand, the Europeans, or if you look at the social interaction, even if you look at the OIC countries, are extremely becoming much more sensitive towards the perception of immigration or migration. If the oil prices continues to go, stock market continues to be shaky, definitely the Middle East is going to take a hit. And obviously that will have a very, very negative implication on India, on Bangladesh, on Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, name any, even as far as Philippines. The obvious reason is our trade, our energy supply, our remittance, earning from the remittance, and even to a great extent, those who are sending money from the Middle East are also footing the bill for their livelihoods. So therefore, you are going to see that some sort of distortion will definitely come into the economic management in these countries. Again, if you go back to the informal sector, the question of herd immunity, the choice between herd immunity or perhaps letting the people go out at the expense of health remains will have a spiral effect not only on Bangladesh but also on India and definitely going down to ASEAN and the Middle East. So we are going to see a stronger immigration policies coming up, stronger racial profiling coming up over the years, and then these countries have no other choice rather than creating their common economy. And unless these countries are able to create their own common economy and governance structure to deliver to the public, we are not going to go anywhere soon. Even if you look at the financial sector, if you look at the non-tariff barriers existing among these countries, even if we look at ASEAN, the intra-regional trade is more than 25%, whereas it is less than 7% in South Asia, having a huge number of population living here, having a greater middle income people, having a greater access to education and services, and perhaps the political will. And even if you look at the social contract, I mean, how are we going to see the state if it is not able to deliver or make a balance between the hard economic choice and the human security choice? And definitely one of the biggest victims will be women. I mean, gender we should never ever ignore. And perhaps we have always talked about mainstreaming gender, but the progress report of these countries in gender delivery or gender equilibria or gender equity is still at the suboptimal level compared to many other states. So that's again going to challenge the very basic of the social contract between the state and the public. And that's where we need to think about that, how we are going to manage that part of the social equation. So if you look at the external debt, which is also rising, I mean, we are pretty happy that World Bank is giving us money. World Bank is giving money, and the hard-hit sectors of tourism in Sri Lanka or Nepal or Bhutan, and stimulus is coming, the state is giving the stimulus, but you have to also understand this money has to be repaid. Nobody is giving you money for the charity, and therefore, how do we repay that? And after the COVID, are the states going to be much more rigorous on the taxing regime? So how are we going to do that? And perhaps even if you look at the countries like Bangladesh and Nepal, or to a great extent Pakistan, we are heavily dependent on ready-made garments. Particularly Bangladesh is heavily dependent on ready-made garments. And if we are not able to diversify our economy, including the Indians as well as the Pakistanis, and definitely for the Sri Lankans, then we are going to get another kind of problem. Now, coming back to one of the very important factors that, yes, public health is in shambles, which has to be streamlined. But how are we going to also bring the public trust on the state system? I mean, look at the way the religion plays an important role in the South Asian culture, South Asian health, and then in fact South Asian economy too. And again, you have seen that in Bangladesh we have a problem with the workers coming back because they need money. We have seen in Pakistan religious clerics are not willing to go ahead, or even to a great extent in India, both in Nizamuddin and other places in the temples in West Bengal. So that's a big part of our society, and that has to be respected. But on the other hand, how do we manage this particular public awareness by passing the public interest related to this particular crisis? And obviously, we are now also seeing that this Wuhan paradox, that we saw in China, has exposed every country. And even if you look at, I get to hear a lot